In December of 2018, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were arrested in China. We are now approaching almost 600 days in captivity for these two Canadians. Recently, I was discussing these illegal imprisonments with a friend and reflecting on how horrible this must be when he said to me, "Have you ever read the story of Terry Anderson's ordeal as a hostage in Lebanon for 7 years?" He told me that Terry Anderson had written about it in his book, Den of Lions, Memoir of 7 Years. I hadn't read it then, but thanks to a recent Amazon delivery to me, I have now. It's an incredible story. This person, Terry Anderson, an American journalist and a Christian, that he could somehow survive the hell of 7 years as a hostage. Listen to Terry Anderson's own words, which may give us some insight into what the two Michaels are now enduring. Terry Anderson writes, "This place is metaphorically as well as literally a hole. It's dirty and full of mosquitoes. The light, a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, is never turned off. The guards are suspicious and unfriendly. Once again, the depression is enormously deep. Only our physical misery distracts us from our black, endless thoughts. The chains are a very heavy emotional and psychological burden, as well as a physical one. Just to feel them, even when I'm not moving, drags me near to despair. And now they're very tight." Over the last few years, we've been made all too aware of the levels of violence, terrorism, and lawlessness existing in places like the Middle East and China. It's hard to believe how cruel human beings can be to one another. But what's even harder for some people of faith to understand is this: why does God allow such evil to exist? The question of evil and the God of love has perplexed people of faith over the centuries. One of the resources in the search to understand this paradox has always been the Old Testament book of Job. For today's service, Rain read for us some verses from an early chapter in that book of the Bible. You know Job's story. Here's a successful man of wealth, high stature in the community, large and caring family. Suddenly, all of this is taken away from him. Job's herds of oxen and donkeys, even his servants, are killed by a band of raiders. Fire from heaven destroys his flock of sheep and cuts down his shepherd. Chaldean marauders make off with his camels and murder more of his servants. A great wind blows up from across the desert, and all his children are killed in the ensuing storm. And finally, Job himself becomes sick, inflicted with loathsome sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And Job is a man of God, a man God describes as blameless and upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. The question confronting us in the book of Job is this: where is justice? Where is God when such horrible things are allowed to happen? And what about Jesus and his disciples, the very Son of God, nailed to a cross? His faithful followers who love him, who listen to his preaching, who traipse with him up and down the dusty roads of Israel for 3 years, giving up home, family, and friends. What of them and their sacrifice? What of their bleak despair and hopelessness at the death of their teacher and leader? What of the black hole of depression they fall into when he's crucified? And for that matter, what about our own lives, our tragedies and misadventures, the times of difficulty and hardship we've endured, the emotional and psychological burdens we've carried, the desperate times of doubt and despair, the sleepless nights we've experienced on so many occasions in life? Maybe not like Terry Anderson, or Job, or Jesus, or the disciples, but bad enough. Hard to endure, and even harder hang on to faith. We didn't do anything to deserve this. We've done nothing to earn such ill treatment. Why is the universe so unfair? Why are we in the midst of this pandemic with untold suffering, grief, and death? What's the explanation? How do we make sense of all this? How does God fit into such a strange and disturbing universe? Job's wife gives a suggestion to her husband. This is how she thinks he should respond to the tragic circumstances of life. Do you still persist in your integrity? She says, curse God and die. Perhaps as Job's wife imagines, God is a miserable old curmudgeon. The world is just God's science experiment. God put it in place. God started it running and now simply sits back to watch what happens. God observes our shabby little lives with detached amusement and practiced aloofness, like a 4-year-old boy continually kicking over the anthill and running around the driveway, stomping on all the worker ants. Sometimes when we read the litany of sorrow and suffering filling our daily newspaper, it's almost impossible to believe in a loving and personal God. Or maybe, as some have suggested, God is just not as powerful as we would like to believe. God is also impotent in the face of disease, famine, and earthquake. There are forces of good and evil at work in our universe, and there is no guarantee good will triumph over evil. For each force has equal power, and the final outcome is uncertain. Or maybe there is no God. God is only the product of our desperate needs and imagination. That's what the disciple we call Doubting Thomas suggests when Thomas hears from the others Jesus is risen from the dead. Thomas says, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in them, and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Much of our world responds like that. If you want me to believe, give me a sign. I want proof God exists, not a dusty old book or a Messiah who lived 2,000 years ago. I want real evidence I can test, proof beyond all doubt. Only then will I believe. Well, there is no proof. We can only point to the ambiguous evidence of our own existence and the existence of our universe. We can only proclaim the subjective evidence of faith. And for so many, that's simply not good enough. But here I stand. Maybe you do too. It's just too hard for me to believe all this came into being from nothing. It's more straightforward and much more sustaining for me to believe all of this has been molded and shaped by the hand of God. When I look up into the miracle of a starlit sky, or hold in my arms the miracle of a newborn child, when I look inside myself to the intricacy and wonder of the human mind and spirit, trusting in the existence of a creator God seems straightforward and inevitable. And when I encounter inexplicable human suffering and tragedy, the hospital beds I've stood beside, the tears of pain, the horror of untimely death, I suppose I've stopped looking for the reason why. I simply trust God, even in the face of the mystery of human suffering. You see, for me, it's no longer the problem of suffering, it's the mystery of suffering, of human pain and sorrow. When I call something a problem, I imply there's a solution to that problem, which I can work out and solve. If I think hard enough, or have enough faith, or pray a little longer, suddenly it will all become clear to me. But that just ain't so. Suffering is a mystery. It goes far beyond my intellect and my faith for me to fully understand. The mystery of suffering does not require an answer. It invites a response of faith, the responsive trust in a God we see revealed in the love and compassion of Jesus of Nazareth. You know, I've always thought it's kind of strange how the scriptures include so many stories I might have left out. I don't think I would have included the pathetic figure of Job in my Bible, a sick old man sitting in the dust, scratching his open sores with a piece of broken pottery. I might have left doubting Thomas out of the story of the resurrection. Why fuel the fire of doubt and disbelief and put such words of skepticism onto the lips of a disciple? Why include doubting Thomas in a book designed to encourage faith? But I suppose real life has its high moments and its low moments. Did you ever see the movie Parenthood with Steve Martin? A sometimes funny, sometimes sad look at the trials and tribulations of family life. Towards the end of the movie, the half-crazy and senile old grandmother, she says, "When some people go to the fair, they like the merry-go-round. Round and round they go. When I get on a ride, I love the roller coaster and the thrill of the up and down." Life is rarely ever a steady uphill climb or a smooth, even line emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Life is like a roller coaster. We slowly click and clack our way up the long hills of life, and then with screams of astonishment and surprise, we look over the edge and plummet down into the unknown future at breakneck speeds. The ancient saints and mystics who profoundly explored the depths of God and the mysteries of spiritual life called the valleys in life desert times. We sometimes call it the dark night of the soul. Times when the circumstances of life or the inconsistent and unreliable nature of the human mind and soul cause us to turn away from God. We all have those times. Job demanded answers from God. Doubting Thomas proclaimed, "I will not believe." Hostage Terry Anderson despaired in his dirty hole. He called it purgatory endless and gray, and he endured it for 7 years. Whether brought on by the mystery of human suffering and personal tragedy, or the wavering and uncertain nature of human faith, we all face the valleys, the desert times, the dark nights of the soul. But here's what I'm wondering. Is it possible, even in the desert, to discover profound opportunities for human improvement and growth? When our spirits are low, when God seems absent, when our prayers seem to go unheard and unanswered, can we even then begin to build new insights and move back into the light and joy of God's presence? For instance, can we learn patience? No doubt one thing Terry Anderson learned during his 2,454 days of captivity is patience. Certainly, Terry Anderson describes himself as impatient in the last few hours of his captivity. That's understandable. But I suppose apart from that, there's probably little in his life now that can make him lose his patience. Like Job, and like all those who have endured long periods of suffering, he learned to wait upon the timing of God. In the desert, we may also learn to be less self-reliant. In desert times, our own resources are at a low ebb, and we may find ourselves leaning heavily upon the strength of others. Job's friends came to sit with him in his grief. But when they did, they were so overwhelmed by his suffering, they simply sat with him in silence for 7 days. But they were present to Job, just sitting with him, helping him to absorb the enormous tragedy of his life and circumstances. When the disciples thought they had lost Jesus forever, instead of scattering to their separate homes, they continued to meet together for mutual support and encouragement. We are not lone rangers, strong and tough on our own. We need others. And in the midst of tragedy or depression or the feeling of being lost, our first reaction should be to reach out to one another. I think that's one of the reasons enduring this pandemic has been so hard. The physical distancing, that we can't come together for mutual support, care, and encouragement. The final paradox of human suffering is this: the desert times may actually strengthen our trust in God. Here's what Terry Anderson writes of his thoughts on the day of his release. He writes, "My life will begin again in a few hours. What am I going to make of it? Can I keep the faith and the determination of this time? Will I be able to keep from slipping back into self-indulgence, the arrogance I knew I was full of then?" I need to tell you, the central image of the Christian faith is not a lounge chair and a cool drink on the beach of Waikiki. Now that's wonderful, and I hope we all have the opportunity to experience such times. But that can never be our meaning and purpose, our goal in life. For the central image of the Christian faith is not a beach chair. It is a cross. Through persecution, through the sweat and tears of the Garden of Gethsemane, through the desert, through suffering and hardship, we are finally surprised by the glorious presence of the risen Christ. This journey of life was never designed to be easy, accessible to babes in the faith feeding on milk and soft cereal. Each step along the pathway to God's kingdom is harder than the last. Ask anybody who's been on the journey. Job, Doubting Thomas, Terry Anderson. Ask Jesus and he'll tell you. The way is narrow and hard, and the path always leads by way of the cross. Do you remember your high school history and the travels of Sir Francis Drake? Among the many stories told of Drake is of one man who stayed at home while Drake sailed the seas. And this man grew prosperous and comfortable. One day he encounters another man who, unlike him, chose to sail with Sir Francis Drake. The rich and comfortable man who stayed home sneers at the sailor and says, "You've not made much out of this adventure of yours." To which the sailor replies, "True, I've not made much. I've been cold and hungry and shipwrecked and often desperately afraid. But I've been with the greatest captain who ever sailed the seas." I need to tell you, I feel just about the same way with regard to my faith. It hasn't made me rich. I haven't always been happy. I haven't escaped hardship or tragedy. But I will continue to travel through this life with the greatest captain who ever sailed the seas. Let us pray. And now unto God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, be all praise, honor, and glory, world without end. Amen.